Welcome, everybody. I think we'll try to get started here. Our subject is climate change, and as announced, the initial focal point, at least, will be the recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees and how that might feed into climate negotiations. Very recently, as you may have noticed in the papers, various other studies have been released over the last several weeks, and we may be making reference to some of those. Our main speaker is Alden Meyer, Director of Strategy and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists and Director of its Washington office. Alden has spoken here before. We're glad to have him back. He specializes on global climate change, renewable energy, electricity policy. It covers a lot of other subjects as well. On climate, he's been attending the climate negotiations since the very beginning and has been a veteran watcher of that subject. He has nearly 40 years of experience in energy and environmental policy, testified before Congress, served on several federal advisory panels, published a number of articles, and is frequently quoted in the press, and attended Yale University and American University for his degrees. So, Alden, we welcome you back.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's get into it. Just to start at the basics, because there we go. Just to remind you why we're talking about any of this, in Paris in 2015, nations of the world and the world leaders actually agreed on some pretty audacious goals for temperature, limiting temperature increase. In the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment to try to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's a global average. Obviously, some regions like the Arctic and Africa will be experiencing greater increases. And this was the new part, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, that last part we fought for very strongly with the small island states, the least developed countries and others, as an aspirational goal, because as you'll see, it makes a great difference to their future and their livelihood and survival. But when we started the Paris negotiations, we didn't think we had a chance of getting that. It was actually seen as a bridge too far. We actually worked with the Marshall Islands and other countries to build a coalition which helped get that into the agreement, and the U.S. was part of that high ambition coalition at the end, along with a number of other countries. Later on in the agreement, in Article 4, they talk about what that means, what it requires, and you'll see parties aim to reach global peaking as soon as possible and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter, so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of that century. That's a fancy way of saying net zero emissions. We tried to get net zero emissions in the agreement. That was a bridge too far. So we took language that governments had previously approved out of an IPCC report, put that on the table through the French, and they couldn't disagree with it because they'd already endorsed it and it was part of the IPCC. But it's basically a net zero goal by mid-century. So the origins of the special report, in the decision adopting the Paris Agreement in 2015, they decided to convene what they called a facilitative dialogue, and I'll come back to that in a minute, among parties in 2018, i.e. at the Conference of the Parties meeting that starts on Sunday in Katowice, Poland, to take stock of the collective efforts of parties and to inform the preparation of their nationally determined contributions. Now, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, is a term of art which means commitments, but again, they couldn't negotiate the word commitments because that seemed too mandatory for developing countries, and developed countries weren't willing to have different words applied to them in developing, so they came up with NDCs as the term of art. But it basically means their pledges or their bottom-up commitments under Paris. And as part of this, they invited the IPCC to provide a special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and related global greenhouse gas emission pathways, because at that time, there really wasn't much in the literature or in the IPCC about how the heck you would get to a limit of 1.5 degrees. And so they wanted that report as an input for this meeting. And this is what you got. It came out in early October, negotiated the summary for policymakers, which is about a 25-page document summarizing some 1,000+ pages of underlying scientific reports, was negotiated line by line by governments. The IPCC is a unique process because the scientists produce the materials, synthesizing from peer-reviewed studies in the literature, working through a pretty complex process. But then the summary for policymakers, which is distilling that into useful information for non-scientists in governments, has to be approved by the governments themselves. So there's kind of a dual approval here. The scientists have veto power over language in the summary for policymakers if they say it's not consistent with the underlying science, but they have to accept changes that policymakers suggest and countries negotiate. So it's a kind of a tricky process. Now this is the report in numbers. You'll see lots of authors and contributing authors drawing from 6,000 peer-reviewed studies with over 1,000 reviewers and over 42,000 comments. So this was a very complex process in the run-up to this report. This is not a fly-by-night operation. It's a very thorough peer-reviewed piece of science. What did it find? It found that, and this isn't news, that we are right now about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels as a result of human activities. We're already seeing consequences for people, nature, and livelihoods. And at our current rate, we would reach the 1.5 degree threshold somewhere between 2030 and 2052, depending both on emission rates and other underlying factors like technology, and as well the sensitivity and reaction of the climate system. And they say that the past emissions, what we put in the atmosphere to date, does not yet commit us to 1.5 degrees, but we're in a pretty dire strait. Now this is distilled from the report. It's a very interesting graph. It shows sort of a heat map for various impacts where we are at different temperature levels. So you see that 1 degree bar, that's the current level above pre-industrial levels, and then you've got 1.5 and 2. The colors indicate green would be there's no associated impacts detectable and attributable to climate change. Magenta, they're attributable and detectable with at least medium confidence. Red, severe and widespread impact, and then yellow, very high risk of severe impacts and presence of significant irreversibility of the impacts. So this is just to show you where we are. Warm water corals, you can see even at 1 degree we're in trouble, which you can observe if you go to the Great Barrier Reef or other major coral reef systems, and at 2 degrees you're in real trouble of irreversible impacts. Mangroves, a little more time there with temperature impacts. Fisheries, the Arctic region, which is very sensitive. Terrestrial ecosystems, coastal flooding, again, you're already starting to see that at 1 degree, as you can talk to anyone in Miami and they'll tell you about the reality of that. River flooding, crop yields, which is of course very important, particularly for developing countries, tourism, and then heat-related morbidity and mortality. So looking across impacts, you can see already at 1 degree, for many of these, we're starting to get in the danger zone. And you also should look at the difference between 1.5 and 2, which I'll come back to because that was a real focus of the report. So what are some of the impacts at 1.5 compared to 2? You would see less extreme weather where people live, extreme heat and rainfall. You'd see somewhat lower sea level rise. You'd see 10 million people fewer exposed to the risk of rising seas. You'd see smaller reduction in agricultural yields of maize, i.e. corn, rice, and wheat, which are the major food crops for most of the world. You'd see global population exposed to increased water shortages, up to 50% less, which is a huge reduction in water stress impacts, lower risk to fisheries, and up to several 100 million fewer people exposed to climate risk and susceptible to poverty by 2050. So basically that 1.5 degrees could be the difference between survival and extinction for many species, certainly for coral reefs and others. So where are we now? This is sort of a projection of the Climate Action Tracker, which is a consortium of a variety of international think tanks, which has looked at the trends with the Paris Agreement. You can see the gray wedge is sort of the baseline business as usual before Paris. The light blue pledges is where we would be if we achieved the commitments under Paris. You can see that would leave us somewhere around 2.6 to 3.2 degrees Celsius at the end of the century. But the current policies to implement Paris don't get us all the way to the Paris commitments yet, so that's north of 3 degrees. And you can see what is needed to get us down to 2 degrees or 1.5 degree consistent pathways. And the thing to draw your attention to there is that you cross the net zero line somewhere around 2050 to 2070, and you have to go net negative after that. In other words, you have to start absorbing more carbon somehow from the atmosphere than we're putting in, which I'll get to in a minute. So they looked at also pathways to get there, and to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, emissions would have to fall about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, which is a pretty daunting prospect given that they're still increasing. That compares to a 20% reduction by 2030 if you're shooting for 2 degrees. Limiting warming to 1.5 would require reaching net zero emissions around 2050 compared to around 2075 for 2 degrees. So you can see with 2 degrees there's considerably more running room there, but you're also exposing yourself to the risk of much greater impacts. And the report also draws on the underlying science showing that reducing non-CO2 emissions, things like methane and nitrous oxides, other emissions would have direct and immediate health benefits, and they talk a lot in the underlying reports about some of those health impacts. They also look at what it would take to get those kind of reductions, and they acknowledge that getting to 1.5 degrees would require changes on an unprecedented scale. Deep emission cuts in all sectors, a full range of technologies, not just technologies, but behavioral changes, things like diet, mobility patterns, etc., and much greater investment in low carbon options that are now projected. They also say that we're making a fair amount of progress in renewable energy, particularly in the electricity sector, but that would need to be mirrored in other sectors: transportation, heavy industry, aviation, shipping, land use, etc. And as I mentioned, we would need to start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And these pathways could have implications for food security, ecosystems, and biodiversity. In other words, we're in the land of trade-offs now. There's no silver bullet solution. There's no perfect solution. We've waited too long on this problem. To achieve these reductions to stabilize the temperature at the levels the IPCC looked at, there may be some trade-offs in some of these other areas which society has to grapple with. So looking at carbon storage technologies, and this is based on the IPCC, but a graph developed by Inside Climate News, they looked across two axes. One, the cost per ton of CO2 in dollars from $0 to $300 per ton, and then the potential carbon storage in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And just to give you a metric there, we currently emit about 55 gigatons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. They say that if you could reduce by 90%, for example, you would be emitting somewhere around 5 gigatons still at a 90% reduction rate. So at the upper end of the scale, you might be offsetting those emissions. Obviously, to start getting net negative emissions, you have to go beyond offsetting and drawing more carbon out of the atmosphere. And they look at the technologies, and there's a number of here they looked at: afforestation and reforestation, low cost, relatively low trade-off, low controversy. We know how to do this, and there you could get anywhere up to 3.5 gigatons a year. Soil carbon sequestration, a little higher cost, but again, fairly acceptable practices that we know how to implement. You could get even more from that. And then some of the more speculative technologies, bioenergy capture and carbon capture and storage, which is combining bioenergy use, using biomass to generate electricity, for example, capturing the carbon, injecting it in geological storage. You could get net negative, but the costs are much higher, and there's also some pretty significant land use and food security implications of that. And then some ones that are much more speculative, but direct air capture and enhanced weathering of carbon with rocks. And the National Academy of Sciences has just launched a major research program on all these technologies, which is worth looking at. The paper they just put out, and we're starting to gear up on looking at what our research and development program in this area might look like, both for the U.S. and globally, because we think even though we're in trade-off land, to be responsible, we have to look at the potential for these and have them at the ready if society makes a decision that we really have to go pedal to the metal on some of these technologies. They also acknowledge that you can't just look at technological feasibility and economic feasibility, you have to look across all these criteria. So institutional feasibility, what would it take to scale up and deploy these technologies at the exponential rate that we're talking about? Are we set up in our deployment systems, our investment systems, governance and regulatory regimes to do that? Social and cultural feasibility, acceptability of some of these options. You talk about major changes in diet, for example, you can't, unless you're going to ban certain forms of meat and diets, and you're going to get some resistance there. So what are the social and cultural barriers to some of these changes? The underlying reports go into a fair amount of discussion about this, and it's worth thinking about for anyone that's looking at this field. And really, for the first time here, they did a very significant piece of work in the report looking at the interaction of the climate indicators and the pathways they analyzed on climate emission reductions with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations out to 2030. And they go into quite a bit of detail about where there's synergies there, where achieving the carbon and greenhouse gas reductions could also give you benefits towards things like reducing poverty, ramping up affordable and clean energy, water and ocean impacts, but also where there may be some trade-offs, and there's some pretty significant trade-offs on land use, for example, and in some of the other SDGs. And so they really lay this out for policymakers to look at and understand. You're not just worried about climate, you're worried about poverty, you're worried about health, you're worried about eliminating hunger, you're worried about work and economic growth and decent jobs for people. How do these things interact? You need to think about that when you're looking at the kind of transformation we need. So that's on the IPCC, and we can come back to any of that in the discussion, but now we're going to where this was designed to be received and listened to and have some impact, which is COP24, which starts in Sunday in Katowice, Poland. Poland, this is their fourth COP. They tend to host a COP every 5 years. They seem to have a lock on the Eastern European region nominating a country to host a conference of the parties. And of course, they tend to come up at very significant points in the process when you're looking at things like the collective scope of ambition and what we have to do. So they're going to be hosting this COP in Silesia, which is the heart of coal country in Poland. And that'll be an interesting dynamic. So what are the major things we are looking at to come out of this meeting? The main deliverable is to adopt a comprehensive set of implementation rules or guidelines for the Paris Agreement. That is mandated by past Conference of the Parties decisions, and the Poles see that as their main deliverable. But as I said, there's also this dialogue to look at the collective level of ambition of the world through its Paris commitments and what that means against the temperature goals in the Paris Agreement, this facilitative dialogue. And our goal is to try to use that process to build political momentum for ratcheting up the ambition of the existing commitments under Paris, because what the IPCC and the United Nations Environment Program Emissions Gap Report that just came out this week indicate is that if we don't change the existing commitments out to 2030, there's virtually no chance of staying below 2.2 degrees, much less approaching 1.5. So we have to try to increase the ambition of the existing commitments, not wait for the next round of new ones starting in 2035. And then finally, we are hoping to see some clear signals on climate finance out of this meeting. There are some elements of the Paris rules which address both historical provision of finance and forward-looking provision of finance by developed countries and others for developing country action, but we also need concrete signals on things like replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, which has now crossed the 60% threshold of commitment of the first tranche of money to that fund, which requires it to start replenishment. There was a very good announcement by Germany actually just today that they intend to double their Green Climate Fund commitment in the next round to $1.5 billion. The NGO community has called for the donor countries to double their overall commitments to the GCF, because with the US on the sidelines now, with President Trump having made clear that we're not going to meet the remaining $2 billion of our $3 billion commitment under Obama, to get a net increase in the GCF funding for the next round above the current $10 billion, you need the other countries to basically redouble their commitments to get to somewhere around $14 billion for this next tranche of funds. So finance is always in the mix in these negotiations, and it will be in Katowice. There'll be a high-level ministerial discussion on finance in the second week of the Conference of the Parties, and we'll be seeing what comes out of that. So in terms of the rule book, it's a wide range of issues that are being looked at here. You can go up on the website and see all the, I think it's over 100 deliverables that they have on various aspects of the rules that need to be negotiated. I should say we don't anticipate this will be the end of the road. There will be work to be done on a number of these rules after Katowice, going into COP25 next year and beyond, just like there were on the Kyoto Protocol after you agreed the basic package of rules in Marrakesh in 2001. But we need to get a comprehensive and fairly robust political agreement on this set of rules by the end of the 2 weeks in Poland to maintain the momentum in the system. So the first group here is what I call the NDC pipeline issues, starting with what's the scope of the nationally determined contributions, what's the information that countries are required to provide with those NDCs when they submit them to the United Nations Framework Convention system, how much detail that they need to go into, what are the accounting regimes for that, how do you vary the level of a comprehensiveness based on the kind of commitment that a country makes. So the US and other developed countries and some developing countries made economy-wide commitments. For the US, for example, it was reducing emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Other countries had higher or lower commitments, but then you also have intensity commitments, reducing the rate of emissions per unit of GDP. For example, China took on that kind of level, or you have some sectoral commitments or commitments based on implementing policies and measures which aren't economy-wide. So different kinds of reporting requirements for those different kind of commitments. Then you flow through the pipeline to how do you review progress towards meeting those commitments over time, and that's the so-called transparency negotiations, which has been a real flashpoint. It's what almost brought down the Copenhagen summit back in '29, for example, when President Obama broke into the meeting room with the leaders of the 4 basic countries, India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, because the primary US objective back then, and one of the main ones now, was to get China and other major developing countries over time up to the level of robustness and frequency of reporting that the US and developed countries have to meet. So that's always been a tense issue, and that's on the table. They have to make significant progress there at this meeting. And then you go down to compliance. Once you understand how well countries are doing in meeting their commitments, what does that mean for compliance? As opposed to Kyoto, we're not in a punitive compliance regime where there's consequences for non-compliance. It's a facilitative regime. It's sort of similar to the bottom-up nature of the Paris Agreement overall, that this should not be punitive, it should not be mandatory. It really is designed to encourage and facilitate countries raising their ambition and achieving their goals. I mentioned finance. A big flashpoint in the negotiations has been ex-ante finance, which is forward-looking projections of climate finance from developed countries. There's not too much rancor about what kind of detail that reporting should encompass. The real controversy has been what happens with those reports after they're submitted. Is there a synthesis by the Secretariat of what they add up to and what they mean for the ability of developing countries to adapt to climate change or to facilitate greater ambition? Is there any ability for developing countries to ask questions of developed countries about their reports and the assumptions and what they mean? Is there any work by the Standing Committee on Finance or the other bodies of the Framework Convention regime based on those reports? The US and other developed countries in Bangkok in September at the last negotiations were insisting that wasn't even a legitimate topic for discussion. There was no mandate to discuss the modalities of what to do with those reports. Developing countries said that's ridiculous, otherwise why are we putting them in? I hear from the pre-ministerial negotiation meeting that was held in Krakow last month that there was some progress on that issue of identifying some compromises, which would be good, because if you don't get that, it could deadlock other portions of the rules going forward. There's Article 6, which was the continuation of market mechanisms and the ability of countries to cooperate bilaterally or multilaterally to achieve their commitments under Paris. That involves some very tricky issues of how do you prevent double counting of emission reductions, the kind of accounting and registry regimes you want to have in place, what happens to the existing market mechanisms and the tons that have been certified under the Kyoto Protocol, clean development mechanism, for example, can those carry forward to meet Paris commitments? What happens with corporate offsets, for example, under the international aviation offset regime? Could any of those bleed into the system and sort of be double counted against a country's commitment? So very tricky technical issues, some political issues there. I don't think those will be all resolved in Katowice, but they have to make some sort of decision on the overall framework and the political compromises on that, so that negotiators next year and probably for the next 2 or 3 years can work out all the details of how those mechanisms work. And then finally, there's this philosophical disagreement between differentiation and bifurcation. Bifurcation, the Kyoto Protocol and the underlying Rio Treaty itself were based on very different obligations for developed and developing countries. So if you were an Annex 1 country, a developed country, under Kyoto, you were expected to take on mandatory binding emission reduction obligations with compliance penalties if you didn't meet them. If you were a developing country, it was entirely voluntary and based on provision of finance and capacity building and technology assistance. For the US and other developed countries, the breakthrough in Paris was that you broke down that bifurcation regime. You would have differentiation. Each country would be able to decide what its fair obligation would be, what it could do, what it could take on. But once they made that commitment, there wouldn't be bifurcation about how those commitments were treated under the Paris Agreement. And at the Bangkok session in September, China, on behalf of the like-minded developing group of countries, tried to introduce some language into the text which would have re-bifurcated the scope and information requirements for the NDCs in that working group. And as a result, that working group made absolutely no progress over the 8 days of Bangkok. As contrasted with the other working groups, the 7 or 8 other working groups, they came out with the exact same negotiating text that they went in with, because the polarization on that was so intense. And again, I've heard that with ministers having gotten engaged, that's cooled down a little bit. The US went over to Beijing, had direct discussions with the Chinese, and they're trying to work this through. But that's always an underlying tension here. A number of the developing countries feel that the common but differentiated responsibility principle of the Framework Convention means that developed countries have generically different obligations than developing. And when you think about it, developing ranges all the way from Malawi or Chad up to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, which in many cases are richer per capita than most of the developed countries. So from an objective point of view, differentiation makes a lot of sense. You ought to treat countries different based on their historical responsibility, their level of development, their capacity, their technological innovation, renewable resources, etc. But a hard line division of the world into categories based on 1992 criteria, from any objective point of view, really doesn't make much sense. But that's the food fight that goes on. And then just to say, no matter what we do, in terms of the 2 degree versus 1.5 degree, we are going to have to do much better at coping with climate impacts. We're seeing that now, not only in developing countries, but right here at home, with the wildfires, with the hurricanes, with the storm surge, with the droughts, the flooding. I mean, it's just, it's undeniable now that the chickens are coming home to roost from past emissions. And even if we are able to get the dramatic reductions that the IPCC talks about in its report, we are still going to see increases in global temperature above the current levels, and we're going to still see reactions from the climate system as a result of those past emissions. Those impacts are going to intensify, which means we need much more support for adaptation, for investments in resilience and what's called loss and damage. which is the unavoidable impacts of climate change once you've done everything you can to mitigate emissions and drivers of climate change, and once you try to do as much as you can to adapt to those impacts. There's going to be both sudden impacts like typhoons and storms, and there's going to be what are called slow onset like sea level rise, drought, desertification, etc. Next year at COP25, there's going to be a review of the mechanism that was created at the last COP in Poland in 2013 in Warsaw on loss and damage, and I think this will be a major focus of next year's COP. But I think most countries don't want to have a big political fight on this issue in Poland and Katowice, but it'll be looming in the background. So there are some issues there that are going to have to be dealt with. This is a somewhat busy schematic of just sort of how we were envisioning the ambition cycle going from now through 2020. You'll see this facilitative dialogue coming to fruition at COP24, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Then over the next 2 years, countries are expected to consider whether they can revise their commitments under Paris before COP26 at the end of 2020. You also see here the G7 and G20 summits over this period, which are important moments to get signals from leaders. You see the Global Climate Action Summit, which was the subnational meeting that was held in San Francisco, hosted by Jerry Brown in September, and I'll come back in a minute to the Secretary General Summit in New York next year. So this is just sort of giving you the timeline and how the process was envisioned to work coming out of Paris. The facilitative dialogue was renamed by the Fijian current presidency of the Conference of the Parties as the Talanoa dialogue. Talanoa is a process that's used in the Pacific Islands to tell stories, to build trust, to build relationships, and to try to come to consensus on difficult issues. And they launched this process a year ago with technical inputs and then a round of workshops and discussions in Bonn, Germany last May. It was actually a breath of fresh air because people came into that and they told stories about their experiences, and these were both negotiators and NGOs and business leaders, and they really put down their masks and their shields and talked as human beings in most of these workshops to each other and really shared experiences. It was a whole different way of negotiating. So it's going to be interesting to see if that carries over into the ministerial portion of this, the high-level political segment in Katowice on December 11th and 12th, where ministers, along with a select group of business and NGO leaders, will be asked to address the third of the three questions that Fiji posed. Fiji asked countries to look at where are we, where do we need to go, and how do we get there. They're saying the IPCC report answers the first two questions, where we are and where we need to go. Really now we want you to focus, how do we get there? How do we close the ambition gap? And so the outcomes of that, there will be a report by the Fijian and incoming Polish presidencies on this year-long Talanoa dialogue process. We are hoping there will be elements in the COP decision or decisions that come out at the end of the 2 weeks that anchor that report from the presidencies, that remind countries why they did this exercise, that renew the encouragement of them to consider increasing the ambition of their commitments by 2020 and lay out the road ahead. We also anticipate there will be one or more political declarations from coalitions of the willing from countries that are willing to signal now that they intend to increase their ambition, even if they don't say exactly by how much yet, to create momentum and trust in the system. So that'll be a very important part of the Conference of the Parties for us. And then, as I mentioned, next September there will be a summit of world leaders during the opening of the General Assembly in New York in conjunction with Climate Week of world leaders. And the goal there, the Secretary General has announced, is to create a political moment when leaders will be expected to come and say what they're willing to do to help address the ambition gap, and are they willing to look at increasing the ambition of their Paris commitments. There's sort of a second track here which is looking at across a number of sectors: energy, industry, nature-based solutions, so forest and agriculture, city action, climate resilience, and finance. What are some high-impact actions that we could agree to collectively that would really transform those sectors and unlock the kind of exponential changes that we need to respond to the climate crisis? So that's going to be a very important political moment. It's going to be the focus of a lot of the NGO community around the world, trying to put pressure on countries to come to that meeting with something useful to say. A few other things, looking at the next year or two. As I said, there will be follow-up to be done to the Paris Agreement work program on things like market mechanisms, land use accounting, the transparency regime. We know there's going to be much more detailed work to do there over the next several years. I mentioned the Green Climate Fund replenishment by sometime in 2019. There's going to need to be a pledging session of donor countries where they come together and agree on a collective new tranche of funding for the GCF. Next year, France hosts the G7 summit, Japan hosts the G20 summit. Those will be important political moments, both in advance of the Secretary General summit. There's key elections in a number of countries next year: India, Canada, European Parliament elections, a number of others that could affect the politics. At the meeting I was just facilitating at World Resources Institute, we had a representative from Canada going through their federal carbon pricing backstop regime and the mandate on the provinces. And she acknowledged that climate and carbon pricing are likely to be issues in the federal election in Canada next year. It could be one of the flashpoints between the current Trudeau regime and the progressive conservative opposition there. So these are going to be factors that are important. COP25, we had assumed that Brazil was going to host it. They had gotten the approval of the Latin American regime to host it just yesterday. They sent a communication to the executive secretary of the UNFCCC saying they were withdrawing their offer to host the meeting based on financial criteria, but we really think it's because President Bolsonaro, the incoming president of Brazil, doesn't want pressure on Brazil to maintain its domestic protection of the Amazon and other programs that would come if he was hosting that meeting next year. So that's just an indication that it's not just the U.S. anymore, where you're seeing some pushback and some retrogression on Paris commitments. It's also in some places like Brazil and Australia, for example. COP26 is scheduled to be in what's called the WEOG, the Western Europe and Other group of the United Nations. That would normally be somewhere in Europe. We're not sure who's going to make a bid to host that conference, but that will be the meeting by which the NDCs have to be finalized and put on the table. So it'll be a very important political moment. It'll also be right after the next U.S. presidential election. So that will be a moment when the world will know whether Trump is a one-term or two-term president. So that's important politically. Just to talk about some positive drivers here. The Marshall Islands in June unveiled a declaration by 25 or 26 countries. It's grown since then, committing themselves to take a serious look at increasing the ambition of their commitments. They just hosted the Marshall Islands as the head of the Climate Vulnerable Forum of countries, just hosted a virtual summit. Unfortunately for many of us here in the U.S., it was on Thanksgiving Day last week, but it was around the clock, sort of modeled on the Al Gore Climate Reality Project 24-hour virtual summits, and they had, I think, some 40 or 50 heads of state and ministers participating in that, all cycling on various time zones. You can go up on the web and watch some. It was fascinating and a really interesting experiment. So they're driving a lot of momentum, and I think they will be making some announcements in Poland about adding to this momentum of countries that are willing to signal that they intend to do more. You had the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, which was 19 countries in September at Climate Week in New York, announced their joint commitment to get their emissions to carbon neutral by mid-century. There's a number of subnational governments and local city governments that have also joined in that. So that's a whole piece of the pie here, people looking at those long-term trajectories and what you have to do to get to net zero. There's the Under 2 Coalition, which was launched by Governor Brown and a number of other subnational leaders, which is international cities and prime ministers and provincial leaders of provinces and states around the world. You've got a host of groups on the local front, C40, ICLEI, International Center for Local Environment Initiatives, the Company of Mayors, which are driving local action, and again, a number of them have put forward net zero or 100% clean energy commitments. You've got the business community organized internationally under We Mean Business, which has been a very important driver here. So there's a lot of good positive signals out there, especially at the subnational level. You've also got in the US the We Are Still In movement, which a number of us helped start driving the day after the last presidential election, when we woke up in Marrakesh, Morocco, to find out Donald Trump was going to be our next president. And we had to say, what does that mean for the US and its commitments to Paris? And we started galvanizing letters from business, from governors, from mayors. That has since grown into a very powerful coalition called We Are Still In, and also organized through America's Pledge, which has said that these cities, states, business leaders, university presidents, others intend to do everything they can to make sure the U.S. meets its Paris commitments, regardless of President Trump's announced withdrawal of the U.S. from Paris. So they will again have a presence in Poland, probably not as big as the presence was last year in Bonn, Germany, where he had a number of governors going, but there will be governors' representatives, mayors, business leaders, others there. They're doing a 4 or 5 day series of side events, press briefings, and other things in Katowice to fly the flag and say, look, President Trump does not speak for all Americans on this issue. This is the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is the group of governors that is the vehicle for the subnational action. There are currently 16 states and Puerto Rico that are part of this. They anticipate that at least 4 states, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and New Mexico, will join pretty easily. And there are several other states. You should take Georgia off this list. It was before the outcome of the Georgia governor's race. But Maine, Pennsylvania, Kansas, of all places, Nevada, could also join. So it's just showing they currently represent about 40% of U.S. GDP and population. If these new governors join, that'll put them over half of the U.S. population and GDP. That would make them the world's 3rd largest economy and 3rd largest emitter after China and the U.S. So it's a significant, political force. And I just talking with the Canadian representative today, they are in a formal coalition with with the U.S. Climate Alliance, Canada, and Mexico, continuing the dialogue that was started by the North American Leaders Summit in 2016 with President Obama, looking at what can be done on a North American level on issues like methane, short-lived gases, electric sector, clean energy, vehicles, etc. So there is collaboration going on in North America, just not with the federal government anymore, but with the U.S. Climate Alliance. That's the good news. Some of the bad news, I would say, lack of political urgency. Despite the mounting extreme impacts, this is not a top-line issue for voters in most countries yet. That has to change if you're going to get the sort of demand for action that policymakers need to see. I would say there's a leadership deficit. A lot of what drove us to the Paris Agreement was collaboration among President Obama, President Xi of China, Chancellor Merkel, other leaders, President Hollande, and others, Prime Minister Modi. Some of those leaders are off the stage, like President Obama. Some of them, like Chancellor Merkel, are dramatically weakened. Others have other priorities, like Prime Minister Modi is facing an election in India next year, and it's by no means assured that he'll be reelected. So we need to create that coalition of leaders, and the Secretary General's focus is really rebuilding that leadership coalition in advance of the summit next year in New York. It's undeniable that the trade disputes, the unilateral tariffs by Trump have created a chaos in the system. It's certainly causing China to rethink its approach on some of these issues, and there's certainly not the U.S.-China partnership that there was that helped drive agreement and ratification of Paris. Security stresses. You could argue there that security is two-edged, but it's both a distraction, but you can make the case that climate change has some implications for global security. If you look at some of the analyses there, which you probably have, but right now in the short term, it's distracting political energy. The power of the fossil fuel industry, they've always been a part of this process from the days negotiating the Rio Treaty before 1992. They're still very active at the national and subnational level. You can just see the outcome of the Washington State carbon tax referendum a few weeks ago, where the oil industry spent over $30 million in one state to help defeat a carbon tax ballot initiative. So still a very powerful industry. The coal industry is probably weaker than it used to be with the wave of bankruptcies and other dynamics there, but the oil and gas industry is still very powerful. Trump administration's behavior, obviously the U.S. is not a reliable negotiating partner. You just look at what happened at the G7 summit last year where President Trump and his Sherpas negotiated a compromise communique text, got concessions from a number of other countries, and then because he got angry at Prime Minister Trudeau's press conference, he instructed his negotiators to withdraw the U.S. from the communique. So that erratic behavior is not a good thing. And then I mentioned President-elect Bolsonaro, but you can add other nationalists, others coming in. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, who has, even though not said they'll withdraw from Paris, the previous Prime Minister was ousted in his own party because of trying to do a pretty modest domestic policy to implement their Paris agreements, and Prime Minister Morrison has also announced they don't intend to contribute an Australian dollar to the next round of funding for the GCF. So it's not just the US anymore. There are some of these other places where you're starting to get resistance. The other bad news is this is sort of the ultimate scientific indicator. After plateauing for a number of years in 2014 through 2016, emissions have started to rise again. And it looks likely they will increase again in 2018. So even though the US has continued to make some gains because of some of the Obama and state policies and because of things like the role of natural gas and renewables in the power sector, the world as a whole is not in sight of peaking emissions by 2020 as is needed and then starting to really reduce dramatically. The United Nations emissions gap report that came out a couple of days ago really goes into great detail on that. And this last slide is just from World Resources Institute, just to indicate that the top 10 global emitters are responsible for almost 3/4 of emissions. Willie Sutton was asked, the famous bank robber, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. These countries are where the emissions are. So it's important to look at Paris as a global regime, but the ones that really make the difference are the China, US, European Union, India, Russia, Japan, then Brazil, Indonesia, Canada, and Mexico. And as I said, there are some problems in some of those countries. We talked about Brazil. You also see Japan trying to build a number of new coal plants to backfill for the nuclear reactors that were shut down after Fukushima. You see Russia, of course, taking a very weak target under Paris and then not even having ratified Paris yet. You see what's happening in the US, of course. The good news there is that Europe, just today, the European Commission came out with a proposal for a mid-century long-term emission reduction pathway and indicated the Commission believes they ought to be shooting for net zero by 2050. That's one of the options in the platform. That'll be moving forward. And they're also probably going to signal in Katowice their willingness to take another look at their 40% 2030 reduction target. The NGOs in Europe are pushing for net zero by 2040 and are pushing for a 55% by 2030 reduction target. But at least Europe is willing to acknowledge that what they're doing is not enough and they need to look at it. But of course, as you know, there's strains within Europe, Poland being one of the main countries resisting the drive for greater ambition. China is a complicated landscape. I mean, the tremendous investment in efficiency and renewables, trying to reduce conventional air pollution, but at the same time continuing to use a lot of coal and frankly financing a lot of coal development in other countries in Asia, along with Korea and Japan. So there's kind of the two faces of China there, and it's very difficult, I think, for the Chinese, given the polarization with the US, to figure out, where do they really go on this? You've got the domestic pressures from the state-owned companies there, and the need to maintain economic growth and employment, to maintain their legitimacy. But on the other hand, they want to be seen as global leaders and sort of stepping into that vacuum created by the US. So really, if you look at this, China and the EU, at least through 2021, when there might be a new president, need to really be the drivers of this regime going forward, and any ability to hold hands and drive up ambition, hopefully bringing a number of the other developed and developing countries along. And with that, I will end and turn it over to John, and then questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. We do have a commentator, Dr. John Byrne, but let me suggest if you have questions, please hold them just for a few minutes, and we will come back to an open discussion. Dr. Byrne is a distinguished professor of energy and climate at the University of Delaware. He's president of the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment, and happens to be a visiting scholar here at SICE this year. He's also been a long-time observer and contributor to the IPCC process since the beginning, and he's the author of many books and research articles. So,
Yeah, so I'm going to just quickly build a couple of, I think, complementary points onto what Alden has really done.
You can disagree with anything I said, too.
Well, I hope, but that was really remarkable that you could get it all in that period of time. So I want to just compliment a couple of things Will had suggested. There's another important, for the U.S. audience, there was an important, our fourth climate assessment. So I was just going to pick up on some things that I thought were sort of important out of there and mention how they actually work well with what you just heard from Alden. So I just thought I would say a couple of quick points just to sort of reinforce what Alden has said too. I think if you're looking for sort of creative new thinking on this matter in the IPCC special report, I think it is where there is this effort to match the Sustainable Development Goals with. This is a triumph of sorts that brought the discussion from simply saying decarbonization in a kind of technology-centric, if you will, sense, to how are we going to actually do all of this, and how are we going to interact with societies and communities in order to make it possible. So I think it's a really a watershed event for this work, and I would highly recommend that you think about it. I want to just say, since Alden brought it up also on the EU's net zero, if you have the dialogue in Europe against having it, what you hear, at least in the media in the US, dialogue in Europe is often not simply a responsibility of an ethical kind only, although it is very high. The sense that this is a responsibility that the societies have is large in Europe. But I just want to say, Europe, having done some important movements on these issues, having gotten much closer to net zero in a number of their cities, for example, than other parts of the world, they see this as actually building the infrastructure for their future. This is where the economy will go. This is where the new technology and innovation will go. And the policy is being built to reinforce that. So I just want to mention, it can get gloomy in this particular field. I just want to mention that I think one of the things that Europe has shown, these parts of Europe, I shouldn't lump it all in together, but parts of Europe have shown is that you can build this into an infrastructure. And that's why you can make what would seem to have been, even 10 years ago, goals of net zero by 2050. That would have seemed to be off the charts, but now it actually has some bearing and relevance, and it's because they were able to do that. So let me quickly, observations on the fourth National Climate Assessment. This is the second volume of a two-volume set that the U.S. Is required to produce under law, and the second report was some worry about how it was going to come out and whether it was going to come out, and then the fact that it appeared the day after Thanksgiving gave some folks worry that it was being minimized by being released that way. That's something that I think we have to decide in a way by the manner in which we use it. But let me just briefly, what I think the climate assessment report, the fourth report, does that's sort of new for the U.S. is it zeroes in on what's the impact of the kind of risks that we are now seeing, that the IPCC report enunciates, those risks. How does that impact the energy infrastructure? They talked about other things, and I'm not trying to make it that it's only it, but they really burrowed in on the energy infrastructure. So they pointed out a few things that I would just highlight for you to consider. They pointed out that the intensity and number of outages, power outages in the U.S. is highly likely to increase unless we make significant changes. And those outages can be traced directly to the problems of high-intensity storms and other factors that are related to climate change. So I think that's a really important finding that folks ought to think about. This sort of marries two topics here on climate change. It brings us to a question of infrastructure. Is the infrastructure that we think is the infrastructure we're going to have for the next 10 or 15 years, is it actually viable? It points out, it does a little piece on what happened after Superstorm Sandy and after Maria in Puerto Rico, and it points out the scale of costs that are involved with these kinds of risks to the energy sector itself. They clock in for Superstorm Sandy at around $2 billion in damage costs, and they clock in at around $17 billion for I wanted to, if I did have a reference just following your. It doesn't. Oh, it's probably the next one.
Okay.
Can I get the? Oh,
There's the mouse. See if you can get it.
Yeah.
let me just see if it is. It's easy if we can. I don't know what they're doing here. Okay. Anyway, let me just, here it is. Let me just, right here. So, if you look at the damage cost current that the U.S. is now having to endure, this I think builds on the point of the climate assessment report is doing. It's staggering. I mean, if you take just hurricanes and just wildfires and you sum it up over a 10 to 12 year period, you're at about $1 trillion US. The fourth climate assessment suggests that the U.S. may have to endure something in the vicinity of $100 billion a year in energy infrastructure related damage costs. I think that could bring you to a realization that even the most powerful country in the world cannot readily absorb this kind of damage cost. This is we talk often about the difficulty of making the transition to decarbonize, but what we also have to understand is what we will endure if we try to stay with this existing system. So that's, I would suggest to you, is a very important message that comes out of the National Climate Assessment. I just want to briefly mention it's also indicated in the report that the Defense Department, the question of security, has already baked in climate change as part of its defense planning. So this has risen to the level of getting people's attention that infrastructure is at risk. And because infrastructure is at risk, there's going to be a level of planning about this on the security side that's very important. Then the last piece, which really just echoes off of the IPCC report. So what we're basically working on with the 2°C in that vicinity is raising the likelihood of 1 meter sea level rise in that very likely to highly likely scenario that the IPCC began to develop a probability standard for weighing these kinds of impacts back with its third assessment, and in this latest report they use that. We're somewhere in the very likely and extremely likely band of probability based upon what we currently know. And the reason that I think that's important for looking back at the National Climate Assessment is the tallying up that they believe that there's something in the vicinity of 25 gigawatts of power capacity in the U.S. that's at risk in a 1 meter scenario. So you're really risking an awful lot of the ability of the existing, the prevailing system to operate if we don't find a way to change the direction. So that's, I would just suggest that's how to add the National Climate Assessment into the story. And I wanted to just offer 2 more points after this. So, we have an existential threat. Some are reading the existential threat as meaning that we have we have a clock, and it's a very short period of time in which to act, and we don't see ready evidence that we have the ability to act. So some are reading this in somewhat fatalistic terms. But I would suggest that our challenge is different. I mean, maybe I just have to do that because I can't concede the other view. So, but I would suggest that we look at it differently, that this really is a matter of our making a decision collectively about what we're going to, about the crossroads of the two countries. So I thought up an example that maybe could be useful for this sort of purpose. The analogy is that when the original effort to launch a capsule into space to orbit the U.S., to orbit the Earth, and to have an astronaut in it, you had to first figure out how you could get it out there, and then you had to figure out how you could bring it back with the human being alive. I mean, that's a kind of important part of the task. Okay, it's not clear in climate change that when we started the process of storing so much carbon in the atmosphere that we really knew what we were doing. But it's clear that if we are going to avert the kinds of problems that Alden really wonderfully detailed, we're going to have to find a way to significantly dial down. So there was a invention of a term for this purpose that challenged the engineers and scientists on the launch into an orbit of a human being in a capsule, and it was called the go, no-go point, right? You had to decide at what point were you going to begin that descent, and that if you missed your point, obviously for that human being, there was serious tragedy that was going to happen. And in some ways, our planet is in a similar situation. We have to figure out what the nature of that point is, and I think we have with the new results, particularly the IPCC report. We have come much closer to understanding what I would call the stop point, the point at which we need to have started the bending down of the carbon emissions curve so that we have a chance, okay, to avert the worst of what is being forecasted. And if we don't do that, I've changed the go, no-go to stop, will not stop. It, in a sense, is our, either through omission or commission, it is our non-action that will then create for the planet and for humanity as a whole the dilemma of what it means to live in a world, okay, in which we didn't stop that climate, that carbon emissions buildup. So I'm offering that as a way, particularly for sort of the policy side of the house, as a way to think about it, that we have to figure out how we are going to weigh that stop, will not stop point. And in that vein, I thought I would just mention a couple of closing points on the policy side, okay? First of all, as I tried to suggest with this note here, we simply do not have a viable, there is no solution of this kind that's going to work. If the U.S. tries to go it alone, which I want to say something about that real quick, but if the U.S. were to try to go it alone, there is no solution to this problem why the U.S. simply withdraws. Paris Agreement will not protect you from a damage cost projection of $100 billion a year. That's not going to happen. So you're going to have to figure out how you're going to act in some fashion in order to deal with the problem. And the second part that I just wanted to sort of emphasize, this has become a point for me that is kind of serious now. We have to find, and I really enjoyed Alden's comments on this leadership issue, leadership gap. We do have a very serious problem, both in the U.S. and internationally, on gaining leadership to take responsible action on this kind of problem. And it's not easy to look particularly at the national government level. It's not easy to get much hope for how alternatives can occur. But there are aspects to this problem that show significant action. Not enough necessarily to solve the problem this week or this year. They're not that scaled yet, but they are the points where significant change are taking place. And so I wanted to just, mention a couple of these for this purpose. So anyone who's looking at the climate aspiration gap, the ability to make a commitment to do something, we almost always suggest that the European Union is the one that's driving the greatest effort to meet what would be an obligation for a significant population. Even in that circumstance, where you have the highest standard being set, okay, which is the EU step, if you look at performance against what that standard is, 301 cities of the European Union. So that, there are a lot of different leaders. Alden mentioned about what's happening in Poland, and you could say several other nation states. But if you look at the efforts to do something about this, you've got 301 cities in the European Union that are actually currently exceeding in terms of performance what was set by the European Union. So that's I think, an important indicator of maybe what we need to start thinking about increasingly as the driver for the kind of at least near-term significant change we're going to get. And I just thought I would briefly mention to an American, or at least an audience or a period in Washington, D.C., that the same is also true in the case of the U.S. If you look at the performance in reducing CO2 emissions, not enough. But if you look against what is the national performance, our, again, local subnational levels typically outpace the national level. And this is an example of a series of cities that span, at least geographically, the U.S. and indicate, okay, what are the sorts of opportunities for change that are pretty significant. So when we say we don't have the political will to act, I think that's probably true. You're talking about a nation-state generated policy system, but I don't think it's true when you look at the subnational level. And I think one of the reasons why Paris Agreement has been acclaimed is that it did, for the first time, recognize and encourage that subnational level. And my last point on this, whatever the U.S. has to offer on the policy side in making significant changes is subnational. It's the effort. We didn't necessarily do feed-in tariffs as well as was done in the European Union. We invented another method. But all of these particular methods that have made whatever change there has been, and there has been a slowdown in the U.S. and a slight dip until this year or until this past year in terms of emissions, that has largely been by the subnational level. So my proposition to you is that we need to do two things. We need to do everything that the international negotiations are trying to do, and because we probably can put together coalitions of the willing at the subnational level with some speed and some depth, that we need to pay a lot of attention in placing our energy to try and help those levels as well. So those were my comments on the piggyback on what else.
Thank you. The floor is open, please, for anyone who would like to comment or ask a question. Please introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. Hi, I'm Joel Jager. Thanks both of you for speaking here. Second year at SICE, worked at WRI for a while, and then I actually was at the Department of State working on climate change this fall. So my question is that the special report on 1.5 is sort of one of the more political reports that the IPCC has put out. Do you think, like, are people going to be talking about it in Katowice? Are they going to, like, or is it just kind of another report to them, or do you think it actually is going to reach that political level that actually has an impact?
They definitely will be talking about it. There'll be a workshop on it the first week, and then a presentation of it by the chair of the IPCC to ministers in the opening session of this Talanoa dialogue on December 11th. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a political report. It has political implications, but the IPCC is pretty careful to stay policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. They lay out the options, the implications of different choices, but as I said, this dual track scientist policymaker process means that governments already own this report because their representatives approved the summary for policymakers in Korea at the plenary in early October, line by line, over 7 days of tough negotiations. So they can't say, oh, that's just those scientists over there. Maybe our president can say that, but others can't say that because their fingerprints are on this. They requested the report in Paris. They negotiated it, they approved it line by line, they're going to hear about it. The real question, I think, is it moving the needle on public awareness and pressure? And I would argue that the combination of the IPCC report and the NCA report that came out on Black Friday, and I would argue that that was actually counterproductive for the administration. It blew up in their faces.
Yes.
That by putting it out so transparency on the day after Thanksgiving, the media said, you're not getting away with this, and they gave it front page coverage. It was on the Sunday talk shows, it was on the evening news. I think they said, you're not going to hide the ball on this one, Mr. Trump. But I would argue that those two reports, in conjunction with Hurricane Michael and the California wildfires and others, have put this issue on the radar screen in the media in a way we haven't seen for a long time on this issue. And I would note that in the Senate debates across the country this year, the IPCC report and extreme weather events and climate change were raised by debate moderators in at least 7 states. We worked overtime for months in 2016 to get one question asked in one Republican presidential debate in Florida about the reality of climate change, and only Marco Rubio and 1 or 2 other candidates of the 16 had to answer it. The fact that this was springing up organically in these debates in the midterm elections means I think there's a change in this. Whether it's going to drive shifts in political commitments by Katowice, I don't think so. I mean, I think what you're going to see there is the initial stage of a conversation, and hopefully, as I said, some indications of openness to looking at potentially increasing ambition over time. The Marshall Islands, some others, have already updated their NDCs and made a net zero long-term commitment, but they're very tiny in terms of emissions. So they're a moral voice, but the big countries that I showed on that last slide, they really have to step up on the plate to this, and no one expects them to do that in Katowice. It's really at the Leaders Summit in 2019 and in 2020 in the run-up to COP26 when they'll be expected to deliver. But I would argue the IPCC report has already generated more buzz than previous IPCC reports have. It wasn't just front page news here, it was in India, it was in Europe, it was in other countries as well. I mean, there's a global team monitoring the media on this, and they said it really did start to move the needle. Whether that can be sustained and as John was saying, affect the underlying politics and the demand for action, I think is up to us. We have to link it with the reality at the local level. So if we don't take the NCA report and go out state by state and bring in ranchers and water engineers and business leaders and retired generals and others and make very clear to people in those communities what the stakes are in this debate, shame on us. That's a missed opportunity. If we don't bring in the subnational leaders that are taking action and making money at it, whether they're business leaders or mayors or governors, and growing their economies while they're decarbonizing at the same time, and show them as success stories and start to change the narrative, that's shame on us. We've got a lot of work to do, but we've got the tools to do it. And as Al Gore likes to say, all that's missing is political will, and that's a renewable resource. So let's have at it.
Please.
Doug Hengel, I'm an adjunct professor here at SAIS. So to me, the leadership question is really crucial, and it's great to see that there are cities in the United States and Europe that are doing more, but we really need cities in China and India and elsewhere. Is there any chance of that? How can we get them to be engaged in this process?
So, we should all have the answer too, but I do think that there has been for example, in China, there is again a similar kind of competition going on. It partly has to do with the way the system is set up. China called forward this Sunshine program, this cities that would be basically significantly powered by renewable energy sources. And it was one of these, sort of like what happened with the renewable portfolio standard in the US. Once one leader stepped out in front and said, we're going to do this. California said, we're going to put this %. New York said, well, we're not going to let you win the race. We're going to challenge you. And the same kind of process has gone on. And so when you look at the cities, particularly in China, there's fairly aggressive policies to make this happen. And it may be, again, that it is easier in a way to build coalitions and get this kind of action going if you look at the subnational level. That doesn't take away the need to do everything that we need to do at the international level. And since the clock is ticking, we should certainly take advantage of that. So I think that's true. We've been interacting in India with a couple of cities in India that are also in this kind of situation where they're trying to set the leader position for this kind of purpose. So I think there is a possibility.
Yeah, and I'd say if you look at the membership of some of the groups I mentioned, the Covenant of Mayors,
Yeah.
ICLEI, C40, they include cities in all these countries, India, China, Brazil, elsewhere. There was actually a very interesting dialogue between U.S. and Chinese cities, the low carbon cities meeting, and it was a very powerful meeting where subnational leaders from the U.S. and China were coming together comparing notes. There's two things cities have in common. They're where the rubber meets the road in terms of climate impacts and infrastructure and solutions, and they all don't like their national governments. Whether they're China or the US, they don't think they're getting treated fairly, they don't think they're getting their fair share of resources, whatever. So when you get these mayors together from cities around the world, whether they're China, India, US, you find they bond. And they really share stories and they collaborate, and it's really powerful, actually. And given that cities are where 70% of the emissions are coming from,
That's right.
that's the delivery belt,
That
right,
is really
for this. So cities and states and the business community can do a tremendous amount. They need support and cover and tax incentives and regulatory and all the other stuff on the federal level, the national level. But really, when you're getting into implementation, that's where the change is going to come from.
And I would just say, in the U.S. case, even when you don't have the right incentives, tax and other finance incentives and so on coming from the central government, the local layer has been able to figure out ways to make their own then. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Put in
Yeah.
place. You've got, I don't know, whatever it is now, 17 or 18 states in the U.S. that as a condition of sale of electricity into their jurisdiction, you must lower the amount of electricity on against a benchmark. That's 17, 18 states saying that the electricity sector has to sell less electricity and more service. And they've been able to do this. It's their choices. It's not something that obviously they take from the federal government.
Yeah, and we came up with a renewable portfolio standard idea back in the early 1990s and started passing that in states starting in the Midwest. And we did it in coalition with agricultural interests and rural economic development interests. When the Koch brother groups tried to go in after the defeat of Waxman-Markey and roll back those state RPSs, they ran into a brick wall. Because we didn't pass them on the basis of addressing climate change. We based them on energy diversity, reducing money going out of state for energy imports, and improving rural economies. They're tremendously popular. You go into Texas, you go into Kansas, Iowa. These RPSs are gold. I mean, people love them. They help keep jobs in local communities. They raise the tax base for schools. I mean, they're bulletproof. And the Koch brothers didn't have a chance when they went in and tried, because we had passed them with Republican legislatures and governors in many places. So that subnational piece can be very powerful. It's not enough, as I think the America's Pledge analysis shows, to meet our national commitment under Paris, but it's a big way towards getting there. And you can't do it without the cities and states.
Sometimes if you want transformative change, you got to find those early pioneers in order to get on that S-curve, to get it moving upward. And it may be that we have a layer that we at least ought to consider as part of the process.
Yeah.
I'm Brandon Cassidy. I'm LA for Mark Keene, 35th District of Virginia. My question is, how do we get subnational groups that you talk about a seat at the international level, especially with this new nationalistic flair that we have at the national level, so that people that are more moderate get pushed out, and people that are more one way or the other get elected, so that they get the seats, and people with level heads are just kind of relegated to the side.
Well, I would say it's a very good question. I mean, the local and the state leaders cannot sit behind their country flags in the negotiations and make interventions, but they have had a very strong presence, and that's increasing, I think, at the international level, where there's a formal constituency group of local subnational officials that is consulted with and allowed to make interventions in the plenaries. There's any number of side events, press briefings, bilateral meetings, with national delegations. They clearly are a growing force in this process, and I think a very creative one. And a lot of countries acknowledge that, you know, we're not really in the business of inventing the institutional framework anymore. We've done that with Paris. We're now in implementation land. And there, it's really these subnationals that are the point of the spear on delivering the goods, and most national governments understand that. I mean, I don't know if our president understands that, but people in the State Department understand that. And the subnational action is featured in the national communication reports every other year by countries into this process. And a lot of what the U.S. under both Bush and Obama were taking credit for was based on state and subnational action. It wasn't as much driven by federal policy. So they are a part of the process, you know, and I think that's going to continue. But you're right that this trend of nationalism and you know, leaders on the extremes coming in is a very troubling trend in the system, not just on climate and Paris, but across a range of issues, whether it's trade or security or other factors. So you know, I think that's something we all have to figure out, and the origins of that are not hard to find. I mean, if you look at what's happened with per capita income in this country over the last 40 years for people without a college education, it's ridiculous. I mean, there's no wonder that people are saying a pox on both your houses and willing to throw a bomb into the system by electing someone like Donald Trump. I mean, you know, it's quite understandable what's driving some of this. Inequality and poverty and other stresses on the system, and frankly in this country neither party has done a great job of coming up with the solutions to that. We'll see if that changes at all, you know, with the midterm elections, if the Democrats in the House do any better job in both policy design and messaging around it than they did the last time they had control. But you know, there is growing anger and frustration and frankly despair out there that's driving a lot of these things. Certainly was happening in Brazil. I mean, that's, you know, the car wash corruption scandal, you know, the growing inequality and relapse of their economy with the crash in commodity prices. I mean, this is all predictable that someone like Bolsonaro is going to come on the scene and take advantage of that the way Trump did. So.
Hi, Debbie Glovis, I'm with the ERP program.
Debbie, how are you?
Yeah. So I have a question. I share, as John knows, we co-authored a paper, a lot of enthusiasm about subnational governments. But there are gutsy governments out there that I'm worried about, who are trying things. I came in late grading papers about the Chilean commitment on renewables, which the question to the class was, how the hell are they going to do it? I mean, it's in the international interest to make sure that Chile gets pretty close to meeting those demands. So how do you see that that process of how do we support governments who are really taking a huge risk and setting up goals that are way beyond what the traditional OECD leaders are doing?
Yeah, I mean, part of it comes down to really delivering the goods on finance, technology, capacity building, and there's a number of interesting initiatives. The Germans, the UK, the French, in conjunction with WRI and other groups, have got this NDC partnership project, which is really trying to figure out how to help developing countries figure out not only how to formulate their NDCs, but how to implement and achieve them. But that takes real money and real capacity. And there are some success stories there, and there's a lot happening, probably not enough, but I think that's a big piece of it. Obviously helping the groups, the political groups in those countries to the extent we can, through the business community, the NGO community, development community, et cetera, provide support to those brave national governments, and making sure they get credit for their successes at the ballot box. I think that's a key thing, and a lot of times we haven't done that as well. We tend to be focused more on beating up leaders that don't deliver the goods than we do in praising and providing electoral and political incentives for the leaders that do deliver the goods. And you know, you may see that in Canada next year with Trudeau up for re-election. You know, he may pay a price for his delivering on his carbon pricing commitments in Canada if the progressive conservatives are able to make that a wedge issue the way that Doug Ford did in the provincial elections in Ontario. You know, so I think we have to look at ourselves too and say, what are we doing to to create the political conditions which support ambition and reward the right kind of behavior. But there's no silver bullet here. I mean, it's hard work tackling and blocking and doing what we can. And some groups are doing some pretty good work on that in that developing country space. I talked to people at WRI that are part of the NDC partnership. I know WWF is doing some work in Chile and Mexico and Peru and other countries, and they're trying to build these tables where you bring together labor, business, subnational governments, the NGO community, investors and finance, and create sort of a collaborative process to provide support for national action. I think that's part of it too. We've seen that succeed, certainly at the state level here in the US.
Yeah.
When we brought all those interests together. You've seen that in South Africa and other places where they brought those people together to help design their long-term mitigation strategy, and it provided much more robust political support for it because of the process of engaging them at the table and crafting it. So I mean, I think there's things we can be doing. I mean, it's just a question of the resources and the time and the bandwidth to do it. But some of it is happening.
I just, on that point, I think there's a couple of things that we haven't done until now. So you've picked out a really good case in Chile. And the level of knowledge maybe about Chile in the wider world is probably very thin and small. So it's hard to rally around Chile when I didn't even know that Chile was doing something as important as they're doing, right? So, but I think one of the things that is happening, and this is crystal ball stuff, but one of the things that is happening is an effort to build these alliances, Alden had indicated, like C40 and ITRE and this Climate Alliance initiative, I think is really powerful. The Europeans did a great job on the front end, and now it's really spreading everywhere. So we're beginning to put networks together to do what you're saying, and that sort of external support, I think, is going to be helpful, like it was in a lot of other things that you could think about, okay? But I would just say that the internal issue also is to build the support for sustaining that outcome, and that probably is, at least in part, a requirement that you build the economic base and support. One of the easier things when you get the stakeholders together, as you know, if you get them together around that the local economy will be better because we do this, that you get the finance and the investor folks in that are showing genuine interest in doing this. So it's probably both, right? It's internal and external. If I'm making any progress on your effort to create however many. So, but it seems to me there are both sets of forces, and one of the good things that I think is happening on the external side is the formation of these alliances that now allow folks to share and then support each other, which I think is very, very important in the process we're in now. But at the end of the day, you've got to also build the support internally, which I think means, as at least a factor, making sure that the economy, the green economy, actually performs, actually does better. And for that, I think the finance and investment folks are really important. Sorry, I just...
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, Jeff Epping with Analyst LLC. How is the, read anecdotally at least, the insurance industry reacted to this? You mentioned that damage costs, it directs their business model directly. Is there, I read anecdotally there's movement with insurers taking a stance, but industry-wide, how is it viewed? Climate change, grappling with it, and increased liability in their portfolio?
Well, I mean, it is a factor they're very aware of. I mean, we talk to them a lot, and they know exactly what's going on and the exposure they have. There's a real difference between the international insurers and in particular the reinsurers that are the ones that insure the insurance companies against extreme losses. They're the ones that are really on the hook, and you talk to Swiss Re or Munich Re, they're out front about this, and they talk about it, and they really try to drive policy on this. U.S. reinsurers, not so much, because they're regulated at the state level, and in many of these states, climate change is a political football, and they don't want to anger politicians and policymakers by mentioning the need to be real about climate change. They just start quietly adjusting their rates or redlining or pulling out of markets, because they can see the writing on the wall, as John said, with his figures about what's coming at them. I think they could be a much bigger force for change, but getting them to have political courage when they're regulated by state officials who, many of whom are in states where to acknowledge climate change is real and we have to prepare for it, is not popular. I mean, look at North Carolina, where the legislature legislated a law saying that the Coastal Development Commission couldn't consider scientific forecasts of sea level rise. It could only look in the rearview mirror at historical rates when it was doing coastal flooding projections. They legislated, I mean, it's like King Canoe Day. They legislated against using the best science because of the pressure from coastal developers who said, if people understand what's really coming at them, no one's going to want to buy their condos in Wilmington and on the Outer Banks. So, I mean, it all goes back to money and politics in a way, and that's, I think, true with the insurance companies as well. They have to be political animals because of their regulatory structure.
I think Alden hit the nail on the head that the way the industry is structured, you would expect the reinsurers to be there first. The way the risk distribution takes place, the entities that are going to be the first ones to take action are going to be the international, and that's going to take time to then filter down so that the state level insurance industry is going to have to put in those new premiums that they're going to have in order to move that risk in a more diverse set of markets back through the international chain. So I think in the case of insurance, you're right. I mean, it would seem like this is a prime target, but it is hard given the way the industry is structured. It's hard to get that signal right. It's really hard to ask a local insurance company to raise rates because of Superstorm Sandy. What people want is to rebuild. They don't want necessarily to pay a higher insurance premium or something like that. So I think it's hard to ask them to be the leaders on that level. But it will come at some point. The reinsurance industry is going to back out and say, we're not going to buy your paper except at this higher rate. Some of the paper we're not going to buy at all, including what North Carolina is doing. And we're just simply not going to buy your paper. And it's going to be much harder then to sort of dodge the issue. But anyway, from my point of view, the reason that you see it that way is the way in which the insurance industry is currently structured. The reinsurance is really where most of the money is. The local insurance is quickly feeding it into those secondary markets.
A very interesting process that was created under the G20, actually, the Financial Stability Board, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the Meyer Bloomberg helped drive, where they brought together blue ribbon representatives, not only from the insurance company, but from bond rating agencies, stock markets, pension funds, state treasurers, other investors, and they produced this series of recommendations about having to climate-proof your business model and disclose what you had done on that. And it's starting to drive investors who are saying, I mean, now they're, Standard & Poor's and others are rating cities based on whether they have a climate resilience plan in place and rating their municipal bonds. So this is starting through the finance community, I think, to really bite in some of these places. And it's not something that Trump can do much about because it's happening in these institutions that are driving global investment. And some of the other national governments are starting to look at mandates for reporting and disclosure, which for multinational companies like Exxon or Shell, doesn't matter what the US does, if they have to do something in France or Germany or the UK, it's global because they're regulated in those markets as well. So I think keep your eye on the leverage of the financial community. I mean, Ceres and other groups are doing great work in this space, and we mean business and some of the others that I mentioned, because that people are going to follow the money and the influence of the money, and if the investment community decides they don't want their assets stranded, I mean, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, quietly divested themselves of all their coal holdings over a 3-year period before you had the coal bust and companies like Peabody went bankrupt and others lost 99% of their investment in coal. They're seen as the smart money now. And so other people are starting to look at that with the oil industry and saying, well, when are we going to get to peak oil demand because of electric vehicles, and do I want to diversify my portfolio out of that in advance so I'm not left holding the bag when the value of those shares goes down. I mean, this is a very powerful lever, which I think more people need to use.
So it may not be insurance as a sector that will drive this, except at the reinsurance level, but finance and investment side will drive.
Yeah, and it's not only the insurance in terms of the premiums they charge for the policies, it's what they do with that money, where they invest that money. They're one of the biggest holders of liquidity and capital in the world because of all the, money they get from their policy holders. They have to invest it to earn the money to pay the damage costs, and where they put those investments is also a lever with the insurance company, and they are starting to diversify some of their portfolios.
That makes sense, I think that's.
Yeah.
Maybe I can ask a short last question. Excuse me. Given the attitude of the current administration against the Paris Agreement and so on, I'm just curious, what do U.S. representatives do at the COP next week? Do they try to undermine things, or are they just silent?
Well, they're not silent. They're very actively engaged behind the scenes in negotiations, and the team at the professional level is led by a career diplomat named Trig Talley at the State Department. He's a great guy. I've worked with him through 3 administrations. He has a lot of integrity, and he's trying to do his level best with his team of representing what he sees as long-term U.S. interests, which are not inconsistent with what it was under Bush, what it was under Obama, in terms of having a robust regime with integrity, with equal standards for countries, major developing countries coming up, as I said, on reporting and transparency over time. And there's some countries which resist having the U.S. at the table given Trump's announcement of withdrawal. But most countries are supportive of that engagement by the State Department team because they want to keep the door open for a future administration to come back into Paris if Trump actually does pull the trigger. He technically can't pull out until the day after the next presidential election, which is kind of ironic because of the way that Paris came into force. But assuming he does follow through on that commitment, withdraws from Paris, if there's a new president in 2021, other countries want to make the Paris rules and the regime U.S. friendly and business friendly so that a future Democratic president, for example, wouldn't have a barrier of re-entering Paris right away. Now, on issues like finance and ambition, the U.S. just tries to keep its head down. I mean, the professional staff. And they will be sending a political delegation for the second week, which will be headed by Judy Garber, who's a career professional at the State Department. And she did a masterful job last year in Bonn at COP23 in making what were fairly constructive and conciliatory public statements and interventions in a way that weren't seen as crossing the red lines. Real skill, I mean, to pull that off. And you may have remembered the side event that the U.S. did last year in Bonn on promoting a so-called advanced fossil fuel technology, which was kind of ludicrous on its face, but it was actually designed by Dave Banks, who was the lead in the White House for climate and international energy policy, as a sort of heat shield to keep the media focus off of Trig and his team, and to keep any blowback from others in the administration to try to change their negotiating instructions by saying, look, the U.S. delegation there is acting in our U.S. national interest by insisting that China and others come up to our standards, the level playing field, and meanwhile it's a venue to promote our coal and nuclear technologies, so what's not to like? So it's a very complex landscape, but no one expects the U.S. to deliver anything on finance or raising ambition, but they do want us at the table on the negotiations of the transparency regime and the accounting rules, because frankly on those things the U.S. is still taking a pretty constructive position behind the scenes, trying to get a robust system that we can come back into later on. Now, how long that maintains and when does Trig and his team get new negotiating instructions from Pompeo or someone else, that's an open question. I have no indication that that's changed before Katowice, whether it changes before COP25 or COP26. Tell me. I mean, part of the advantage they have is the high level sub-cabinet positions in state haven't been filled. So the undersecretaries and assistant secretaries that would normally give political instructions to negotiators, those offices are empty. There's really nothing between Trig and the 7th floor of the secretary's office, so that's actually worked to their advantage because there's no one to change their negotiating instructions.
This is just an anecdote on your question, but just what happens? I just So if you went to the US governmental events, the main events that the US government would do, I felt they were, especially in the second week, were underwhelmed. There was very little attendance in them. But if you went to the We Are Still In,
Subnational tent, oh my God, it's packed.
they were mobbed.
Yeah, it was great, it was great.
Yeah.
We do have a little reception for those who can stay on for a little more discussion. Please join me in thanking our speakers.